We're live on Facebook, Mark, already. So why don't you ask him the question, Karthika?
Okay, so Mark, we were really interested to find out what kind of food transformation systems you're actually doing in India, especially around the agri-tech space.
Sure. So as background, Omnivore is the largest and the oldest agri-tech focused venture fund in India. We've been around since 2011, made north of 22 investments now. Our first fund was 260 crore. The new fund that we finished raising is about 700 crore. So been the pioneers of this space in India, myself and there are about 10 other people in Omnivore offices in Mumbai, Delhi, Bangalore, and Chennai. Examples of things we've been doing lately, we backed a farmer platform in Eastern India called Dehat that has about 4 lakh farmers on it, helping them with inputs, outputs, financing, and advisory. Sequoia came in about 2 months ago and invested. It's their first big agri-tech bet, so we're excited about that.
Wow.
We've backed a company called Clover in Bangalore. Clover is trying to build the first large fresh produce brands in India, right? Sabzi in India is largely unbranded.
Okay.
And they're trying to build the first real consumer connected Sabzi brands, all greenhouse grown.
Cool.
So, standard quality, climate resilient, available 12 months a year. And showing some great traction there. That was a deal we did with Excel and Mayfield. We have a company that recently raised a Series A called IntelloLabs. IntelloLabs is basically applying AI across fresh produce value chains to digitize quality. And they're working globally, big customers, including Reliance in India, Dole, Ocean Spray, lots of global customers. They are as global as they are Indian, even if all of the back end is in India.
And especially during COVID, has a product that has been put out obviously by IntelloLabs. Has that made a big difference to the supply chain?
We think so, and we've generally seen that agri-tech startups over the last 3 months have seen unprecedented demand. I think farmers find themselves in a very precarious situation under COVID. And whereas the old status quo, right, of, I sell to my Arthya, I sell to my Mandi, that's been so disrupted that it's accelerated the migration towards more digital supply chains and these next generation kind of agri-tech companies.
Okay, so here's a bit of a trick question. If COVID hadn't hit, how much of a curve would it be for that digitization to happen?
Listen, I think the digitization, we invested in Dehat, 15 months ago, right? And they had gone from almost nothing to 2 lakh farmers in about 2 to 3 years. So the point is that these trends were happening. They are just being accelerated.
Fair enough.
So are you also seeing some, a lot more people getting into sort of ag tech and, because of this whole concept of being self-reliant?
When we started Omnivore, agri-tech was, and by the way, we always say agri-tech. There's a very specific reason. Ag tech can be mistaken for ed tech or advertising tech. So agri-tech, generally people know what you're talking about.
Okay, yeah.
We're pretty militant about that. So, so you were asking, we are seeing an unprecedented level of new startup creation and new startup launching. And what's interesting is the entrepreneurs themselves are very different than they used to be. I would say we've seen 3 waves of this. In the first wave, when we first started investing, 2011, 12, 13, most of the founders were just weird and crazy, right? It was there was no way to generalize. It was just a very strange, group of people that saw an opportunity. I think after that we started seeing more people from good corporate pedigrees. We backed a startup called Stellaps that was digitizing the dairy space. Now, you know, Bill Gates and Qualcomm are investors, but back then it was 5 dudes who had quit Wipro very recently, you know, with soldering irons in a garage.
Okay. I think we have Andrew just join us as well.
Great.
Hi, Andrew. Good morning.
Hello. How are you? Technical meltdown. I apologize.
Not a problem.
I actually had a weird Zoom issue as well. I had to replace. I got a different laptop and reran Zoom because for whatever reason on my first one it wasn't working. It's the first time it's happened.
So I'm actually going to swap. I'm going to swap from my cell to my computer. So you'll see a quick transition in a moment. So apologies for that.
No problem. I'm glad you're adding a nice British accent to our whole panel.
We love British accents. We love them.
Oh, do we? Okay, super.
We do.
Oh, there we go. Swapping.
Oh, wow. That was pretty good.
Look at this. Dogs barking, doorbells ringing, COVID life in its entirety.
So you're joining us from New York, right, today?
Oh,
so
wow. I love the two backgrounds.
So dog barking, goodness me.
We can hardly hear the fellas, not a problem.
Oh, really? Okay, super.
Yeah. So just so I just wanted to say, okay, what we so officially for those of us, we are streaming on various social media platforms. So we got Facebook Live, we got Zoom. So I just want to let everybody know that to send their questions in on either the Q&A section on Zoom or on your usual comment section on Facebook Live. And then Karthika will sort of collate all these questions and then ask them sort of towards the latter part of our discussion so we don't break the flow of the speakers today. So that's just kind of standard housekeeping stuff for you guys. So do have those questions coming as they occur in your mind. Please feel free to type them in. We'll definitely take them towards the latter part of the conversation today. So just, I know that everybody's joined us. We're just waiting for Andrew again for a second here. Not a problem, Andrew, take your time. He's having a few technical challenges, I think. Give us a couple of seconds here, folks. Oh, that's
totally worth it. Oh my God. Oh my God. You're muted, Andrew. You're muted.
What I said is you can't see him. He's a magical dog. So yeah, he kind of pops in and out.
I did this with my daughter on a webinar once.
What's his name?
Coconut.
Oh.
But he thinks he's a Rottweiler. So as soon as somebody knocks on the door, he's just bananas.
Oh wow, the little ones always think they're 10 times bigger than they are.
Yeah, it's called a Coton de Tulier. It's like a Bichon, but
I thought it was.
Went for a husky.
My sister has 2 of them, and her mother-in-law's a breeder. I saw it for about 1 second, and I thought it was for Madagascar.
Correct.
Oh, wow.
And my daughter, I went for a husky, and my daughter was with me, and she won. Thankfully, I like him. It's all right. Anyway, let's get started. Really apologies about the glitches.
No, not an issue. So welcome to Pandemic Punditry, both Andrew and Mark. So sort of the question I have actually for both of you, but maybe Andrew, you can answer the first and then Mark go second. So what is the investment thesis behind Big Idea Ventures for you, Andrew? I mean, what are you focused on primarily?
Yeah, so there's two parts to that question. Big Idea Ventures, the company, has a specific remit, and that's to solve the world's biggest challenges by backing the world's best entrepreneurs. It's our opinion that entrepreneurs, scientists, engineers are ultimately going to be the solvers of some of the kind of challenges we've created for ourselves, unfortunately. Our first fund, which is called the New Protein Fund, is focused on plant-based meat, seafood, dairy, cell-based meat, seafood, dairy, and ingredients and technologies that will facilitate both of those categories. And the reason why is because animal protein is such a significant contributor to CO2, climate change, land use, water use, antibiotics in the food system. It's impacting the climate. It's impacting personal health, and it's also impacting animal welfare. So that's the first fund.
Okay, and Mark, what I know you're talking about this a little bit earlier, but maybe for the benefit of everybody who just joined.
Sure. So Omnivore is a fund that is entirely focused on backing entrepreneurs building the future of agriculture and food systems. We are based in India. We focus on entrepreneurs from India, though many of our portfolio companies, while focused on India, are also looking at global challenges. We're a fairly early stage investor, so we come in at the seed, sometimes the Series A, sometimes the Series B, very rarely pre-seed. We think that's good for accelerators, and we'd like to partner with them, but that's a less common occurrence for us. And we're looking at agri-tech startups that are solving the challenges faced primarily by Indian farmers. We see that as a huge challenge around profitability, a massive challenge around resilience, and some terrible issues around sustainability. So that tends to be our focus. Though, as I said, many of our portfolio companies are also looking at global challenges in addition to what is required for the transformation of Indian agriculture.
Okay. Karthika, you had...
Yeah, so Andrew, I have a question for you. So we know you invested in Shioknates, right? We featured Dr. Sandhya recently in this program. And we also know that Ryan Betancourt, who we featured last week, is an advisor of your fund. So you have made so many investments in this space. Why are you so bullish about it?
About cell-based?
Yeah.
That's an interesting question. I think we've gone through an evolution on that. When we were originally talking about cell-based, we were saying it's going to be maybe 5, maybe 10% of the fund. And there are a couple of reasons why we were keeping it small. One, because ultimately we were not convinced that the consumer at the end of the whole cycle, so, given, let's say, the next 10 years of significant investment, moving from $30,000 a kilo to $3,000 to $300 to $30 to $3 a kilo, that's going to take us a while. So we were not convinced that at the end of that whole cycle that there were going to be consumers on the end who were prepared to purchase the product. Right, so we could spend, a decade, probably hundreds of millions of dollars from an investment and R&D perspective to get there, and at the end of it, nobody's going to buy the stuff. That was kind of our original concern. Couple of things has happened, I would say, in the last 6 months in particular, and it relates to what's been going on with COVID. I think there's some erosion in the trust around the traditional meat, traditional animal protein system. And there's some degree of harmed trust around the food system in its entirety, in terms of, not necessarily in terms of cleanliness or germs or whatever, but certainly in terms of the fragility of the supply chain. It's much more fragile than we ever imagined, right? I think we've seen that in the last 3 or 4 months. So from a cell-based perspective, I think it's possible, and I've been saying this for a few years, that there will be a consumer demand on the end of it at the end of that 5 to 10 year cycle, because people will see that the cell-based process is actually a cleaner one, and is less open to pathogens and to adding challenges, disease, etc., into the food system than the traditional animal protein system, unfortunately. So in other words, there will come a time, perhaps in the next 5 to 10 years, where people will say, I kind of want my meat to be made in an environment that's sterile, that has no feces, that has no antibiotics, etc. Whether that's going to be global or not, I don't know. I think it's quite possibly going to happen in kind of countries like Singapore, like China is going to see it. I think North America will see it. India I think it's potentially a ways off, and there's a significant population that needs to be fed. But again, one thing that we don't necessarily consider is that cell-based can be or should be ultimately a very efficient system of growing the cells, because it can be in commercial environments, stackable commercial environments, without needing large fields or large factory style, warehouses filled with animals.
So Mark, I mean, in contrast, you are on the agri-tech side. So what was the motivation for setting up this fund? I mean, in contrast to some of this new sort of cell-based, plant-based meat stuff, I mean, your focus is primarily on sort of the existing, optimizing the existing sort of systems to produce higher yields, safer, better, with traceability, things like that, I'm assuming.
Look, I've been living and working in India since 2007. My background is not from investing, it's from agribusiness operations. So I used to be with Syngenta in Europe. I moved to India in 2007 with Godrej Agrovet, helped with the turnaround of this large, very Indian middle-class kind of conglomerates agribusiness division, which was in quite a bit of trouble back in 2007. We turned it into a great success. But that was very much, average Indian agriculture, right? So we sold cattle feed, poultry feed, aqua feed. We had a poultry business, which I helped to put into a joint venture with Tyson. So I know what the other side of this looks like. We had agrochemicals. So it was very much meeting the farmer where they were at that moment. There was innovation, but I would say that the level of innovation was, not breakthrough kind of stuff. And I think my interest in launching Omnivore, which we did with the support of Godrej, was to help catalyze a next generation of innovations that would rapidly change and transform Indian agriculture. Because again, we're talking about 130 million farmers and their families, about 700 million people, more than half of the Indian population being very directly impacted by this. And those people are struggling with, as I said, profitability, resilience, and sustainability. And that was the motivating factor for getting this first venture fund off the ground, and for keeping at this space really for the past decade. It's kind of consumed my life. Though I will tell you, we're very interested in what we characterize as innovative foods, in alternative protein, in cellular, in these trends. We definitely probably have a bit of a different perspective on it than some of the global investors. We think the domestic market play in India for most of these things is more moderate, whereas we think India potentially is a source of feedstock in a huge way for the rest of the world. India is one of the largest producers of pulses and millets globally. So we think that's a very interesting way that India can play this global trend. We think that India has very strong fermentation capabilities. So maybe on the cellular side, they can play this trend. In terms of the domestic market in India for plant-based alternatives and cellular alternatives, I think it's not as much of a story of those specific alternatives, but for the fact that in India generally, food startups have not been very successful, right? Innovative, challenger brands have not been very successful. It's a very traditional eating culture. And it's very easy to make the mistake of thinking that everything in India is a huge opportunity because 1.3 billion people and all of that. But the reality is, if we were to look at venture-backed food businesses, CPG, packaged food businesses over the course of the last decade, I can't name a single one that has crossed $50 million in sales.
So Mark, are you looking also potentially at making investments maybe around in the region, Sri Lanka and other SAARC countries potentially as well, where they may have, the mindset may be different. They have an export orientation, so they may be looking to sort of.
To be clear, I think we're looking at making investments in India related to alternative protein. I'm hoping we'll do some with Andrew. I'm excited to see him, starting to work with Indian startups. I think we think that's great. When we look at the rest of the region, because I've seen this now a few times, you guys are obviously thinking very regionally in whatever you're doing.
Well, regionally and globally. I mean, this part of, we have people tuning in from all over the world right now, but I mean, we have.
We're very interested. So I used to be I've done work in Bangladesh before. I think, as a fund, we are focused currently on India. Many of our portfolio companies are also looking at opportunities in Bangladesh, in Myanmar, even in kind of the Mekong, in Vietnam and Indonesia. I think when we do our third fund in a few years, we'll probably have a bit more of a regional focus. I'm very interested in the kinds of startups I see coming out of these countries now. I think they are where India was 5 or 10 years ago, and we were part of building that story in India, and we want to be part of building that story elsewhere.
Great. So if you were to, each one of you, I mean, Andrew and Mark, you both of you, if you were to pick sort of one from your vast portfolio, pick up one company that you find to be the most compelling or interesting in terms of either impact or innovation or technology, what would that be? Maybe Andrew, you go first, and then Mark.
So I can't do that. The reason being is I've got 25 companies in my portfolio. I'm actively engaged with all of them. If I choose one, 24 other companies are going to.
Andrew, which child of yours do you love the most?
Yeah, exactly. Well, as I only have one child, that's a really easy question. But unfortunately, I have 25 portfolio companies. If you ask a more specific question, maybe I can pick one company that might address that specific.
Okay, so from all the from all the sort of companies you have in your portfolio, you have made some recent investments in India, for example, right? So maybe you can talk about that one. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, that's easy. I've got one Indian company. It's very easy to pick that one. So Evo Foods is an investment we've just made. Two folks focused on the plant-based egg category. Very, very interesting company. One thing I really love about them, by the way, is, and this is kind of to Mark's point that he just made, Evo Foods is very focused on developing and bringing this product to the Indian market. So in other words, they're not thinking, we're going to start this company, we're going to get invested in by Big Idea Ventures, and within the next 6 months we're going to launch in North America or in Singapore, Asia, or whatever. These guys are very focused on their marketplace. They understand it. They know the consumers. They know the network. They know what people are looking for. They know the ideal price points. And so their focus is on bringing a really great plant-based egg product to the India market in multiple formats. So, for example, the Just Egg product you've seen in other places is a liquid egg in a bottle. These guys are looking at that, but they're also looking at kind of other formats as well. So yeah, we're really excited about the Evo team.
And Mark, so you want me to pick one for you to talk about, or you have one in mind?
I mean, if you ask me which portfolio companies of ours have touched the most farmers, I would say probably, we have a portfolio company called Stellaps, which is digitizing the dairy sector in India. Dairy is, India has 300 million head of cattle, right? It has, dairy represents about a quarter of agricultural GDP. Milk is the largest crop in India. It's bigger than rice. It's bigger than wheat in value. And they have managed to digitize about 50,000 village collection centers. There are billions of dollars of milk that flow through the Stellaps platform now. And I would estimate maybe 3 to 5 million farmers in India are on the platform as we speak. So that's scaled up like anything.
Wow.
Okay, so I have a question for Andrew now. So you have offices in New York and Singapore and food accelerators in both of these locations, right? So what kind of characteristics or attributes do you look for in a company or an entrepreneur that you're looking to invest in?
Sure, great question. So the kind of words above my head, Big Idea Ventures, are pretty outlining what we're looking for. We're looking for great teams with big ideas which won't just touch 100 people or 100,000 people in a particular region. We're looking for businesses and teams who have the capability and the vision to move a business into the global kind of arena. So the reason why we set up in both Asia and North America, and soon we're looking at India, we're looking at Europe as our kind of next kind of evolutions. We want these companies to impact as many people around the world as possible. If they're going to do good things, if their products are doing good things for the planet, we want those benefits to be felt around the world, not just in the US or Singapore or whatever. One interesting thing, by the way, of having two locations, we thought they would work very independently of each other. Strangely, they cross-fertilize. So the teams in Singapore were standing on the stage on demo day in New York, pitching to a room of US investors. The US teams have gone across to Singapore, looking at the Asia market as the next opportunity. So joining these kind of geographic dots is actually a really good way of facilitating the global ecosystem of kind of food innovation. It's something to see. It's kind of organic. I like it.
Okay, thanks, Andrew.
So Matt, for you, what would be the sort of the no-brainer ideal candidate if you want, I guess if a company wanted to approach Omnivore, I mean, what would be your dream team company or dream idea that they would bring to you?
Look, I mean, I think we're pretty open on the ideas. I think, in general, teams matter a huge amount in this space. And, I had mentioned earlier, right before Andrew joined, that there have been sort of three waves of entrepreneurs in this space. So the first wave was idiosyncratic. The second wave was very corporate, people that have very strong corporate pedigrees. And now we're in the midst of a wave of people that have come from other startups and are entering the agri-tech ecosystem. And I think that's what we find to be tremendously exciting, because the reality is migrating from corporate to startup is always difficult, right? You're going from an environment where you were supported in innumerable ways that you didn't even realize to suddenly having to do everything yourself. And I think what's interesting about entrepreneurs that are coming from other startups, not necessarily agri-tech startups, right, but high growth startups like Urban Clap or Ola, is they've seen this transition from 0 to 1, 1 to 10, and 10 to 100. And they know what that playbook looks like. And so I think having those entrepreneurs entering the agri-tech space for the first time is very exciting, because I think we're going to see much faster acceleration in the growth of agri-tech startups with people with those kinds of experiences under their belt at the helm of this next generation of agri-tech startups.
So you're actually bullish that you'll see a lot more investable opportunities come your way with this new wave.
Agri was talent starved in a big way for a long time. And I think now there is a growing recognition from investors, from founders, that this opportunity, right, that represents 25% of the Indian economy, half the population, is worth people's time. And I think, that wasn't the case, certainly wasn't the case 10 years ago when we started. 5 years ago, it was still controversial. And I think what's interesting about this COVID moment is the only part of the Indian economy that is working normally right now is agriculture. Okay? Even there, it's strained and stressed and challenged, but it's the brightest part of the economy at this moment. And so I do expect to see better founders, better entrepreneurs, better ideas, better teams coming out of this space, and much more interest from investors.
Great. Karthika, you had a question for Andrew, I think.
Yeah, I'm a sucker for a British accent, Andrew, so I'm going to keep asking you questions. So is this pandemic going to change your outlook in the space? And do you think that there will be bargains to be had in terms of valuations?
Do I think it's going to change? Is it going to change my thesis? No, I think the what's happening in the plant-based, cell-based space is a consumer-driven shift in consumption. So I don't think it's a fad. I don't think it's just a blip or a trend. I think people are waking up to the impact their consumption is having on climate, on animal welfare, on their own personal health. They're looking for healthier, cleaner label, more plant-based, more organic, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's a shift in consumer demand, and therefore we as investors, mission-driven investors, we're focused on making sure we're giving consumers what they're looking for, and that it is a better for you, better for the planet, solution. Do I think there's going to be deals? I've always considered the price of anything is good. The price of anything is based on what people are prepared to offer it for and what people are prepared to pay for it. In the plant-based, cell-based space, we were prepared to pay higher valuations because we saw the opportunity as investors. Will we be able to potentially invest in more companies because the valuations are going to be a little depressed? Yes, I think we will. I've seen some investors in my space look at this as an opportunity to kind of squeeze or push back on the entrepreneur. I don't like that approach. I've seen people taking term sheets off of the table midway after offering it, on the basis of times have changed. We didn't do that. We have a specific deal at the accelerator stage, and we then follow. So just to kind of back up a sec, we invest in two stages. We invest at the accelerator stage, where we're putting a certain amount of money in for a certain amount of equity, and then we give our best companies, our strongest companies, follow-on investment. And about 70% of the fund is supposed to be dedicated to that follow-on stage. We didn't change our deal at all. We just literally invested in another 12 to 13 companies in the last 4 weeks. Same deal as 6, 7, 8 months ago. We could have gone and said, we're going to give you half the money now for the same amount of equity. They probably would have done the deal, and I wouldn't have slept well that night, and I would have felt badly about myself because I think it's a good deal for everybody, and I want to do deals that make everyone feel good about the relationship. I'm not looking to, because things have shifted slightly, get a better deal for me and a worse deal for our entrepreneurs. As soon as we do the deal with our entrepreneurs, by the way, we put the fact that there was a financial transaction behind us, and we instantly focus on how are we going to work with this entrepreneur to make this company successful. We don't really think about the financial side until we're asked to invest again, and we have to kind of run the numbers to make sure it's a smart thing to do, or when there's an exit in the company. So the financial side just sort of disappears as soon as it's done, and we focus on what's right for the company.
Thanks,
I'm sure Mark is exactly the same.
Yeah, and Mark, what about you? That was probably a follow-on question.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, we're continuing to invest. We've just done a seed staged transaction that should be announced in a few weeks. I think the one implication of COVID is that historically we didn't do a lot of Series A's. We've done some this year, but it was always the Series A was a little too expensive, and definitely the Series B was way too expensive for us. And so I think as COVID adjusts pricing, it is very likely this year that we will do more Series A's than normal, and we'll even look at Series B's. Whereas, a year ago, our check size, in a seed round, we can do anywhere from kind of $500,000 to $2 million. And in a Series A, Series B, we can go up to 4 million. And historically, at a Series B stage, for example, it made no sense. The valuations were so high that you didn't get much for your 4. But I think this year that'll be a bit different. So I expect us to be doing slightly later stage this year, even as we continue to do new, fresh seed stage transactions.
Karthika, do you want to go to, because we're sort of at that time.
So we have a few audience questions. Yes.
Sure.
One from Ed Rogers from Charlottesville, Virginia. Welcome, Ed. So his question is, have your views on sugar crystallized or changed in view of COVID? How does this manifest in your investment focus?
Our view of sugar?
Yeah, sugar, crystallized.
That was a good dad joke or a bad pun, one of the two.
Yeah, I saw that too. I got what they did.
So my broad view of sugar, and I have gotten in trouble in Krishi Bhavan in Delhi for once saying this, is the Ag Ministry, Andrew, is sugar takes India's most scarce natural resource, which is water, and converts it into diabetes. And I've always felt that, and I continue to feel that. I feel like sugar is a legacy industry in India. It is political. If it was in New Jersey, we would say it was mobbed up. I'm saying this, Andrew is sitting here in Princeton, so he knows what I mean by that.
I'm just watching you dig a hole for yourself. I'm waiting for the sugar people to come and just like put a bag over your head.
But you know, and our view is that it needs to be less of a priority in Indian agriculture. And I was proud for many years when in Agri-vet, one of the businesses that we had was oil palm. And whenever I say that, people suddenly mouths drop and people imagine forests of burning orangutans in Indonesia. And that's absolutely true in Southeast Asia. In India, right, which imports 2/3 of its edible oil, largely from Malaysia, Indonesia, there are about 200,000 hectares of oil palm that's been planted. In India, that oil palm is largely planted on former sugarcane fields, and it's net afforestation, and it's a net carbon sink. And it reduces this incredible hole in Indian food security where 2/3 of the edible oil comes from outside. So generally, to be clear, is oil palm, palm oil the healthiest oil? No, but people are going to eat edible oil, and it is far healthier than consuming sugar. So, my hope is that India can kind of pivot from this focus on sugarcane, sugar exports, and the sugar economy to try to, convert those fields into things that aren't killing us.
Good, great answer.
Should I go to another question, Avi, or do you have something?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, okay, good. Okay, so wow, we have lots of questions today. So one from Jeevan. Hi, Jeevan, again, a regular. Is there a good set of investments that you think can build from countries such as India, SL, Pakistan's strengths? Example, a plant naturally grown in the region that could be exciting.
Is that for Andrew?
Mark, do you want to? Is that me? Or I mean, I've got.
I don't know if you
Mark
guys
has
can go.
so much more experience in this.
No. Go ahead.
So one of the
I can share my thoughts after you.
Okay. Plus, you're more of a risk taker than me, so you'll say more sort of outrageous things than I will. So we've had a number of. So when we opened our doors to the last investment round, we do that every 6 months. We got about 200 applicants. I think we ended up getting about 10 or so from India. Some of those companies were innovative around ingredients. They were pretty innovative around the development of crops, raw materials, etc., that would actually impact the plant-based space as a new ingredient. The ingredients that have traditionally been popular or common in plant-based have been pea protein, soy, and wheat. India has other crops that would allow them to be key players in the plant-based space, which is growing very, very quickly. And I think there's a significant opportunity for India, whether it's chickpea or other crops, to add to kind of the world supply of plant-based protein. So we saw some really good innovations around that. The one concern I have about that area is I don't want India to think of itself as a kind of net exporter of stuff and not without the ability to kind of bring a lot of the innovations around this category of plant-based, cell-based into India. But there was a kind of another question from someone else about, are people in India moving towards plant-based? When I was there, and this is anecdotal, I was seeing a lot of folks in India wanting more meat an aspiration rather than less meat. I don't know if Mark would agree with that. So I'm not seeing plant-based. I'm sorry.
1,000%. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm not seeing it as a big growth area for plant-based food, except in certain parts of society. So back to the innovation question, I got off track. I've seen some really interesting innovations around ingredient protein and related.
All right. So Larry, I'm not sure if you're following this, but there's a bit of a fascinating conversation going on between Mark and one of the attendees about palm oil and whether it's healthy or not.
Oh, is there?
Okay, I'll just move on to another question unless there's something from you, Larry.
No. Keep going with the questions.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah. Okay. Lots of people want to get in touch with Andrew. Lots of people want to get in touch with Mark. We have one question from Umaid Gupta. Welcome. Do you think insects might become a viable source of protein in animal, poultry, aquafeed in the coming years?
Insects.
Yeah. Broadly, yes. I mean, I think there's a lot of there's no big India-focused insect startup that's received tons of funding the way like Insect has and others. But I think as that technology gets proven out in other markets, I certainly think it will come to India. And yeah, I mean, I used to be part of a big feed company. It's certainly an interesting substitution of, for example, fish meal, right, or meat and bone meal or whatever. So I definitely think it has scope.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Yeah. So more questions. From Sangugita Yadav. Hello, everyone. As a student, my question is, what are the gaps you're filling in the market today, and how can we students help or take part in your objectives?
Is that for me or is that for Mark?
Either one of you guys can go.
From my point of view, we try and become the first investors in companies that we're excited about. That's sort of, we're not looking to create the same portfolio as all the other folks in our space. We'd like to be first, and what that means is we're prepared to go a little earlier. So if you want to get backed by a company like ours, start a business.
Start a business.
It's that simple. Start a business, get it going. Validate the consumer or the customer demand, whether you're a B2C or a B2B. Come up with a concept, bring it to market in some way, validate it with consumers, with customers, to prove that there's a significant demand for whatever it is you're bringing to market, and reach out. That's probably the simplest way. And you can do that via our website, which is basically the words above my head with .com at the end.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest advice that I would say is, I think India punches well above its weight on digital technologies, whether it's hardware or software, and shockingly below its weight on life sciences. I once said that I can find more Indians with Indian passports working on innovative ideas in life sciences in 1 kilometer of Boston than I can in all of India. And so what I would tell you is it would be great to start seeing more people with life science pedigrees, biotech pedigrees, chemical engineering, bioengineering, launching startups. The reality is when they do, it's like the case of your entrepreneur from Shock, they go abroad to do so. And we'd like to start seeing those in India itself, and people either staying behind and launching or coming back and launching. We just don't see that very much.
Are there exits in the biotech space in India? I mean, you talked before about companies starting businesses not growing to above $50 million in the consumer side. Are there
consumer food?
No, I get that, but are there exits on the biotech side in India? In other words, if they start the journey, is there an end destination?
There are some examples of it. There have not been a huge number, but certainly more than consumer food. I can't think of a single large. This is one of the things that we debate this on consumer food quite a bit. There is no successful exit to date of scale in consumer food in India, full stop. Hasn't happened. Just hasn't
But on
happened.
the biotech side?
There have been some. Many
Because
were
if
a
you want
couple
to
of years
encourage
ago.
people to,
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, if you want to relocate or encourage people to not go to Boston, to not go to the Bay Area, they'll want to stick around in India if there are the kind of opportunities for wealth creation at the end of the hard work. So.
Yep, definitely understood.
So, Karthika, do we have any more questions? We are sort of at the 45-minute mark, so I just want to make sure that.
Yeah, we have a few more that we can ask. One from Prasad and Mark or Andrew, either of you can take it. Thanks, Prasad, for joining us today. Any consumer data of the last, of the past 3 months in India, which points, to a consumer's preference to plant-based products?
I don't think, and Andrew can speak to it. He studies the space more closely. India doesn't have a lot of plant-based players right now. There's not a lot of product in market to speak of. The most common product that's there isn't very good quality, right? So whether it's soya chop, right, or sort of the stuff that the Good Dot guys make, which I don't think is very good. I would say generally, it would be very hard to see that trend at this moment.
Yeah, and I think consumer data generally is sort of, is not sort of collected in the same sort of rigor that you find.
The other thing to add is that so many of these businesses were disrupted, right? So, in some places, food delivery stopped working. A lot of these businesses were focused on Horeca sales. That stopped, right? Amazon deprioritized startups in favor of stuff that needed to be done at scale. So I don't think the data, I think the US data is very interesting on plant-based protein over the last few months, but I don't think the India data is either here or there. And I think it'll be more interesting to see in 12 months where some of these startups are. Andrew, Andrew, would be interesting to hear kind of what the US story.
Yeah.
So consumer data is one thing, and we're seeing a lot of growth in the US around plant-based products. We also saw in Q1 this year, prior to COVID, more investment going into plant-based companies than the entire previous year, end to end. So the investor community is very excited about the plant-based opportunity. We're seeing growth in North America. I'm seeing growth in Europe. Interestingly, I was always considering China as one of the holdouts in terms of not moving towards plant-based, apart from in the kind of main cities, i.e. Shanghai, Beijing. And that was just because it's trendy. And so they were sort of moving in that direction. I'm starting to hear noises from the Chinese government, from within the press and so on, that they see plant-based as one of the kind of solutions to some of the food challenges they're having, particularly around pork and other things. So I wouldn't be surprised if we didn't see China becoming more relevant and important to the plant-based, cell-based space over the next, 4 or 5 years.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right.
Just a time check. You guys have a couple of minutes to take a couple more questions, or do you?
I've got about 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Andrew, you're okay as well? Karthika, do we have a couple?
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's actually one really interesting question which both Mark and Andrew can answer from Somveer Singh Anand. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. Will marijuana be the next big plant export from India, and what role would hydroponics play here?
I will answer that because I have studied the space a little bit, and not just in terms of recreational usage. So there has been some very good early work done on the space from a regulatory perspective, and full marks. There's a startup called Bohico that has the Bombay Hemp Company that has done some really good work on getting the government to think differently about marijuana and hemp. I think the good thing in India is that historically, there is no reason for the prohibition that exists. And the prohibition that exists in India is actually a completely schizophrenic prohibition, because on one hand, if you show up in Bombay airport with a bag of weed, you will go to jail. On the other hand, the government manages dispensaries around Holi for bhang, right? So you have government sanctioned weed, and then you have criminal prosecution at exactly the same time. So, you know, people always say about India, whatever is true is also false, whatever is false is also true. This is definitely the case in the marijuana space. So the good thing is India has no reason to prohibit marijuana culturally, right? If you go back to the Vedas and the Upanishads and Ayurveda in general, it is considered to be a sacred ingredient. And the good thing is India also has Ayush, which is the Ayurveda ministry, where that seems to be a mechanism by which this is getting legalized. And likewise, multiple states, notably Uttarakhand and Madhya Pradesh, are looking at deregulating, right, the growing of this to allow it to be at commercial scale. So all of that combined, I would say, I do think it's going to be an interesting opportunity in the next few years. With respect to, you know, hydroponics, I think there's a great opportunity in hydroponics in India for greens and basically stuff that you consume directly, right, where you care about the taste and the quality and you don't want it cooked in a soup of sewage and pesticide, which is most often the case when you buy greens, right, from a mandi, you know, or from a you know, a lariwala, right, local kirana, right, because, you know, these are grown in the periphery of Indian cities in very, you know, mediocre conditions. On the other hand, we have huge hectarage potential in India, so I don't see why you wouldn't be growing marijuana and hemp outdoors. If you wanted to put it under protected agriculture to reduce the usage of pesticides and raise yields, sure, but hydroponic is probably a bit of a leap right now.
Okay, good answer. Yeah, one more, and then we call it a...
yeah, unless
Sure.
Andrew wants to answer the marijuana question as well.
So I don't know anything about the category. I've avoided marijuana CBD as a market. I avoided insects. There are certain things that just sort of instantly strike me as something everyone rushes towards and then quickly runs away from at a later date. And insects and marijuana are the two areas that I kind of avoided. So not my spaces at all.
To be clear, we haven't taken bets there either. We're just tracking it, and I think the CBD bubble and marijuana bubble in America has been particularly crazy. So certainly, you know, I'm hoping that people figure stuff out before we start seeing a lot of startups in that space in India.
Okay. Hi, Coconut. Thanks for joining us again. Another anonymous question this time. What kind of agri-tech is considered a potential in regions such as India, especially since robotics might not be as competitive because labor is so cheap?
So that, I think, is a bit of a misnomer. Labor is not cheap in India for farming. There may be slightly different dynamics right now because literally 120 million urban migrants have marched back to rural villages. But at the same time, you know, the way to think of it is this. Your average Indian farmer had 3 kids. He has pushed those children out of agriculture, right? Almost uniformly. And there has been historically for 20 or 30 years, a very heavy dependence on rural migratory laborers, right? So for example, Biharis in Punjab. So right now, you've got this issue where, you know, let's go back a year ago, right? Rural labor was actually very expensive, very super expensive at the time of planting and harvest. And that was exacerbated over the last decade by things like Narega that encourage people to stay in their own micro farms, not work on other people's farms, and basically dig a ditch when the government tells you to, and then fill the same ditch when the government tells you to. So all of that raised the price of rural labor rather sharply, which has encouraged tractorization, automation in general. And we've actually backed a robotics company focused on making the lowest cost small robots out of India for both India and global markets. I think how it plays out right now in the COVID era with all of these shifts in rural labor is going to be very interesting. But I still think in general, you're not going to have the kinds of labor you need for Indian farms when you want that labor. And as a result, automation is going to accelerate in the space.
Okay.
Great. I think we're at the time. You said 5 minutes, I think we exceeded it by a couple. So Andrew and Mark, interestingly, the two of you on this panel conversation is interesting because, Mark sort of represents a whole basket of, everything that plant-based companies would require, right? In terms of grains and protein isolates, pea protein, whatever else. And, he's focused on sort of optimizing that. And then there's you who's sort of focused on the consumer piece of this, producing stuff that, people would want to eat globally. So I think that, thank you so much for sort of joining and sort of filling the gap for us between sort of, the famous farm to fork thing, but we've got the farm to fork here on the VC side. So that's why we kind of structured this panel discussion, because, for better or for worse, Mark, you represent the kind of the farm side of the thing. Of course, you got, entrees onto the others. There's overlap here. And then Andrew, you've done a, amazing job of sort of giving birth to a lot of these companies with very, very interesting sort of, portfolio companies making all kinds of interesting products. We're looking forward to sort of hopefully featuring a few of them as well. And so I just wanted to thank you on behalf of Karthik and myself for coming on this panel. We've had a fascinating discussion, I think, a lot of questions from lots of people, which you have also kindly answered electronically as well as in person. So thank you again for coming and joining us. We have actually Peter Luba joining us on the 9th, and he's from, you guys must be familiar with him from Microtechnologies. So we're going to learn about mycelium and how, he's created a whole company that now supplies some of the raw material for Beyond Burgers and others. So very interesting, sort of this is fermentation side of the protein, smart protein side. So we've talked about the plant-based, cell-based, and he will fill in the fermentation equation for our listeners. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us. Have a great morning in New York and Colorado for the two of you, and a good night for the rest of the people on this side of the planet. Thanks again for joining.
Thank you. Thanks everyone.
Lavendra.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Mark.
Bye-bye.